been authorized. And I've read to you quotes from virtually everyone in here who would agree with that, except for those individuals who want to cede this power to the President of the United States. With that, I yield the floor, and I understand under unanimous consent the Senator from Ohio would be the next speaker.
Ask unanimous.
The Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. At the conclusion of my remarks, I ask unanimous consent the Senator from Iowa, Senator Grassley, be recognized.
Without objection.
Thank you. And I thank Senator Inhofe for the sensible nature of his words in terms of the difference between a presidential and a congressional earmark. I think he brought good sense to this, and I appreciate his words. Madam President, I rise in support of Amendment number 1481, co-sponsored by Senator Merkley. Our amendment that will, the amendment to the Stock Act. I thank Senator Gillibrand for her good work managing this legislation. A USA Today editorial from Tuesday said if lawmakers were really concerned with ethics, they'd put their equity holdings in blind trusts so they wouldn't have the obvious conflict of interest that comes from setting the rules for the companies they own. Banking committee members wouldn't invest in financial institutions. Armed Services Committee members wouldn't invest in defense contractors. Energy committee members wouldn't invest in oil companies. How simple is that? How straightforward is that? How right is that? These stories simply don't reflect well on the world's greatest deliberative body. Most of us think these investments don't affect our decisions here, and they probably don't. But isn't it time we held ourselves to a higher standard? Senator Merkley and I are proposing the Putting the People's Interests First Act as an amendment to the Stock Act. It would require senators and their senior staff who are subject to financial disclosure, no more than 2 or 3 or 4 of our staff people in each office, the most well-paid, those in the most sort of highest-ranking decision-making position, and the senator, to sell individual stocks that create conflicts or to put their investments in blind trusts or to invest only in widely held mutual funds. No one's required to avoid equities. We could still invest in broad-based mutual funds or exchange-traded funds. You can keep your ownership interest in your family farm or small business. I'll repeat that. In no way does this affect your ownership in your family farm or small business. If you're setting up a blind trust, you can instruct the trustee to hold on to your stock in your family company. This rule would be similar to steps that have already been taken to address financial conflicts of interest, or at least the appearance of financial conflicts. Senate Ethics Rule 37.7 requires committee staff making more than $25,000 per year, way more strict than our amendment in that way, to divest himself or herself of any substantial holdings which may be directly affected by the actions of the committee for which it works, unquote. The Armed Services Committee requires staff and spouses and dependents to divest themselves of stock in companies doing business with the Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. The committee does permit the use of blind trusts. When asked about a requirement to divest, former Defense Secretary William Perry said, "This was painful, but I do not disagree with the importance of doing this. The potential for corruption is very high. It keeps our government clean." In the executive branch, federal rules and federal criminal law generally prohibit employees, their spouses, and their children from owning stock in companies they regulate. All Senator Merkley and I are saying is that members of the Senate should hold themselves to the same standard that we already require of much of our committee staff and executive branch employees. We have our staffs. Our staff requirements are more severe than ours, and we're the ones whose names are in the book. We're the ones who are sworn in to do the bidding of the American people. We're the 100 people in this so-called exclusive club, yet we're going to have different rules for us than we have for a $30,000 a year staff person. That hardly seems right. Some argue that selling all our stock will make us lose touch with the rest of society. That kind of thinking just falls on deaf ears for most Americans. The ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee doesn't invest in stocks. Instead, he invests in state and local bonds with a small amount directed into mutual funds. When asked, Congressman Frank of Massachusetts said, "I get a steady 4.5%. I help my state in the process. I'm a patriot. I'm making money, too." Why should members of the Senate who own stock in oil companies vote on issues that affect the oil industry? Why should members of the Senate who might own stock in a pharmaceutical company vote on issues that affect health care, on a generic drug bill or on a biologics bill or on the legislation over on Medicare or Medicaid? Appearances matter. Right now, the American people don't trust that we're acting in the nation's best interest far too many times. Investing in broadly held funds or a blind trust will keep us in touch with society. It isn't a retreat from the U.S. economy. Instead, it will keep us from picking winners and losers. It will show the public that our focus is on policies that will help grow the economy. Again, I'm not accusing any of my colleagues, if they own an oil stock, that they would vote for, that they vote for more tax breaks for the oil industry. I'm not saying they do that. I'm saying there's the appearance that some of them might do it. Public service, we need to remember, is a privilege. Folks around Washington are already paid well on these jobs. There's no reason they need to be buying and selling stocks in small or multi-million-dollar portfolios. When asked about the fact that the Senate Armed Services Committee conflict of interest rules apply only to staff and Department of Defense employees, but not to senators. Again, when asked about the fact that Senate Armed Services Committee conflict of interest rules applies to staff people, and again, not necessarily highly paid staff only, staff people and Department of Defense employees, President Bush's Deputy Secretary of Defense Gordon England said, Congress should live by the rules they impose on other people. No kidding. Congress should live by the same rules we impose on our staff. I mean, really, in a State of the Union message, the President said, let's limit any elected official from owning stock in industries they impact. We all, as we cast votes, the 100 members of the Senate, have an impact on all kinds of industries every day, on all of our economy. I agree with Undersecretary England. I agree with President Obama. I agree that with Senator Merkley, as we offer this amendment, it's simple, it's direct. The public should expect nothing less from us. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator from Iowa.
Before I speak on an amendment, I have to ask unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside, and I would call up my amendment number 1493 and make that amendment pending.
No objection. The clerk will report. The Senator from Iowa, Mr. Grassley, proposes amendment number 1493.
I think the reading thus far constitutes a reading of the main.
Without objection.
The Wall Street Journal recently reported that political intelligence is an approximately $100 million industry. The article also says that expert networks employ over 2,000 people to do political intelligence here in Washington, D.C. Now, we have to say approximately because no one really knows how many people work in this industry. We don't know who they seek information from, what happens to that information, and how much they get paid. And this is a problem if you believe in transparency in government, if you believe in the purposes behind this legislation, and I do, the underlying legislation, that members of the Senate and Congress should not benefit from insider trading information. And so we have people in this city or people that come into the city to get information on what Congress might do or what the regulators might do that might affect the stock in some company or something. And this political intelligence information is gathered and given to people who presumably profit from it. Or I guess these people wouldn't be employed in the first place. So there is a growing unregulated industry with no transparency. If a lobbyist has to register in order to advocate for a school or a church or a private corporation, shouldn't the same lobbyists have to register if they're seeking and getting inside information that ends up in making people a profit? This is especially true if that information would make millions for a hedge fund or a private equity firm. So, we have current law. Under current law, this is not the case. no registration of these people. We don't know who they are. So, you go back to Amendment 1493. It merely brings sunlight to this unregulated area. It defines what political intelligence lobbyist is and requires that person or firm to register. In other words, make them do what under the 1995 law every lobbyist has to do. I understand that some would say that there have not been hearings on this subject and that it should be studied first. But there isn't much that's complicated about this amendment. It's pretty simple. If a person seeks information from Congress in order to make money, the American people have a right to know the name of that person and who that person's selling that information to. Now, that's just pretty basic good government, isn't it? Just like if a person is a lobbyist for a piece of legislation under laws going back to 1946 and amended since then, they have to register. The public has a right to know who the lobbyist is, who they're working for, and what they're lobbying for or against. So this amendment isn't just helpful to the American people, though. It isn't helpful just to make people responsible, because the more transparency you have, the more accountability there is, the more openness we have in government, the better off we are. But it also, I make a case to help the American people, yes, but it's also going to help members of Congress and our staff who are trying to decipher their duties under this proposed legislation. Senators have raised questions. How will we know if the people we speak to trade on what they say? So, to answer that question, to make the people doing it responsible, to have more transparency in government, to even help members of Congress and our staffs, because these political intelligence people are pretty smart. They know where to get the information. They come to us, ask questions. You might not know why they're asking the questions. So it's going to help members of Congress and our staff as well. By requiring lobbyists who sell information to stock traders to register, members and staff have an easy way then to track who these people are and who they would sell their information to. This strengthens the bill from my point of view and helps members and staff comply with its requirements. So, Madam President, I hope that we can pass this amendment soon and bring light and transparency to this growing industry and know who, when we're talking to, who they are, what they seek, who they're working for, etc. With that, I'll yield the floor. You want me to? I suggest the absence of quorum.
Mr. Akaka.
dispensed with?
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise again today to speak on behalf of fairness. We've heard quite a bit from the President on the campaign trail about fairness. But it appears that there is no interest in fairness when it comes to transparency for the executive branch. The bill that we're currently debating here in the U.S. Senate will subject Congress to additional reporting requirements for certain financial transactions. The goal is to ensure that members of Congress and congressional staff are not using their unique access to confidential information for personal gain. That goal is worthy. I believe this is an appropriate goal and one that I fully support. I do not understand, Madam President, however, why the additional reporting requirements do not extend to members of the executive branch who arguably have even greater access to such confidential information than members of Congress and their staffs do. Madam President, it only seems fair that executive branch officials who are already required to file annual financial reports, as we are, also be directed to meet the same additional reporting requirements being imposed on the legislative branch. I've yet to hear a compelling argument against equity between the branches. Some people have argued that the executive branch has other ways to deal with insider trading. Think about it. But none of those will subject executive branch employees to the same public scrutiny as this legislation would. I believe what is good for the goose, it seems to me, should be good for the gander. We've heard that all of our life. I understand that there is a willingness on the other side to expand the reporting requirements, but it would fall far short of parity. Madam President, some have said here that it would cost too much. But if we're willing to expand the population of executive branch officials required to report publicly, then any further expansion will only present marginal additional cost. Currently, less than 1% of the executive branch workforce is required to file financial disclosure statements. The other 99% aren't. My parity amendment will not expand that universe. It will only require them to meet the same reporting standards that will apply to the Congress itself. Madam President, as I understand it, the Democratic alternative to my amendment would produce some bizarre results. For example, a Senate office administrator who meets the reporting threshold would be required to report publicly as directed in this bill, but that the head of enforcement of the Securities and Exchange Commission would not. That's bizarre. A Senate scheduler may have to make additional public disclosures, but the General Counsel of the Federal Reserve would not. Madam President, this is not fair, and I believe it's unacceptable. My amendment simply says that if you're an executive branch or independent agency official and you currently file financial disclosure reports, you will have to comply with the same public reporting requirements contained in this bill that we plan to impose on the Congress. My amendment also contains the same military personnel exemption that the Democrat alternative does, as well as the same 2-year implementation provision. Madam President, my amendment is simple, fair, and deserves the support of every member of this body. If my friends on the other side of the aisle really believe in fairness, this would be a very good way to show it. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Suggest absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Without objection.
On behalf of Senator Boxer, I ask unanimous consent that the Boxer-Isaacson Amendment number 14889 be modified with the changes that are at the desk, that the order for a Collins side-by-side amendment be vitiated, that the Paul Amendment 1485 be modified with changes that are at the desk, further that the order for the Lieberman side-by-side amendment to the Paul Amendment be vitiated.
Without objection.
I ask consent to set aside the pending amendment so that I may call up on behalf of Senator Lieberman the side-by-side amendment to the Shelby Amendment number 1491 and on behalf of Senator Portman his amendment 1505.
Without objection. Clerk will report.
Thank you.
The senator from New York, Mrs. Gillibrand, proposes for Mr. Lieberman, proposes an amendment numbered 1511. The senator from New York, Mrs. Gillibrand, for Mr. Portman, proposes an amendment numbered 1505.
Madam President, we here in the Senate are so close to doing something so basic, so common sense, to begin restoring the faith and trust that the American people have with this institution. I am encouraged that we have found more to agree on today than that which we disagree on, so we can bring this bill to the floor for a vote. I want to thank Leader Reid for his extraordinary perseverance and leadership on this issue. I also want to thank Chairman Lieberman and Ranking Member Collins for their vision and their hard work in bringing this strong piece of legislation to the floor. I also want to thank Senator Scott Brown and our other co-sponsors who have worked so hard to do the right thing for the American people. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have worked with us in good faith to bring this legislation to fruition. We have tried to focus on the specific task at hand, and that's closing loopholes to ensure that members of Congress play by the exact same rules as every other American. While there are some amendments today that won't meet that test, there are others that will make this bill stronger, and I believe that the final product will have teeth. This sorely needed bill would establish for the first time a clear fiduciary responsibility to the people that we serve, removing any doubt that both the SEC and the CFTC are empowered to investigate and prosecute cases involving insider trading of securities from non-public information that we have access to when we do our jobs. We are entrusted with a profound responsibility to the American people to look out for their best interests, not to do what's in our financial interest. Let's show the people who have sent us here that we as a body can come together and do the right thing. Today, we are taking the steps forward to show them that we are worthy of their trust. I encourage all of my colleagues to take this step with us today. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank the Chair. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the Quorum Clause be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. In 6 or 7 minutes, the Senate will begin a series of votes on the matter before us, the Stock Act. I wanted to take just a few moments to restate the underlying main purpose of the legislation, which is to respond to the public concern informed by testimony before our committee from experts on securities law that it's not totally clear that members of Congress and our staffs are covered by anti-insider trading laws enforced by the Securities Exchange Commission. So the number one accomplishment of this proposal would be to make that crystal clear. We're not exempt from that law. We shouldn't be exempt. I presume most members of Congress have assumed we've never been exempt, but this will make clear that if anybody does cross the line, they can't defend themselves by saying that members of Congress are not covered by the law. We've also added in committee a couple of provisions which embrace the old but still important notion that sunshine is the best disinfectant in government by requiring that the annual financial disclosure reports that we file will now be filed electronically and available, therefore, on the Internet. Right now, these are public documents, but when they're filed in the office of the Secretary of the Senate, you've got to go there and make copies of them to see them. As Senator Begich, distinguished colleague from Alaska, said, that's not easy if you're an Alaskan. This will bring that system up to date. The third part, I know controversial for some, but I think sensible, is to require that within 30 days of any stock trades, disclosure forms are filed with the Senate and also online. I can tell you that the Securities and Exchange Commission has made clear in testimony before the House Committee and in discussion with our staff that that kind of periodic requirement for disclosure of trades in stock and security will enable them, will help them do the job we want them to do to make sure that insider trading laws are not being violated, and of course will keep the public, our constituents, informed of what we're about. A number of amendments are up. As Senator Reid said, I sure hope that we don't have roll call votes on all of them. A number of them I think will receive unanimous support on both sides, and I hope we can adopt them by voice. There is one amendment, Senator Shelby's Amendment 1491, to which, as part of the agreement, I've filed a side-by-side, as it were. I support the goal that Senator Shelby has here of holding the executive branch accountable in ways similar to the way we are. That is, the amendment, generally speaking, would extend this 30-day reporting requirement and the disclosure requirement to a very large number of executive branch employees. And that's, to me, the problem. It's too broad. It would be, again, create a cost and I think an unnecessary reporting system for many executive branch employees. And I want to point out here that when it comes to avoiding and preventing conflicts of interest, the executive branch is probably well ahead of the legislative branch, our branch. The ethics rules, requirements, and guidance that have been put forth over the years by the Office of Government Ethics and at the agencies are extensive and address a wide range of potential conflicts of interest or improprieties, and they have teeth, criminal sanctions. For instance, high-level executive branch employees already file financial disclosure forms that face a very extensive system of agency review. These agency officials and career civil servants are often forced to divest themselves of their stock holdings if they seem to be, excuse me, in conflict with their responsibilities, or to recuse themselves, not to be involved from matters to minimize potential conflicts of interest. And that's a much different standard than we impose on ourselves, which is the standard of disclosure. I have introduced a version of Senator Shelby's amendment, which I think achieves his goal in a significant way, but not so broadly. Rather than tens of thousands of people encompassed in the Shelby amendment, my amendment is targeted at policymakers who are most equivalent to those of us here in Congress and those who work with us, and that is positions in our government that are Senate confirmed, and also certain high-level White House and agency staff that may not be Senate confirmed but are policy makers. These individuals are public officials with visible high-profile roles and extra scrutiny that comes with increased reporting requirements seems to me to be more appropriate for this group. It would include the President, the Vice President, appointees in the White House, including the so-called policy czars or special assistants to the President, as well as members of the Federal Reserve Board. So I hope that we can take this significant step to achieve what Senator Shelby had in mind, but not, if I can put it this way, overdo it in a way that will actually, according to comments we've had from people in the executive branch, get in the way of the existing very tough ethics rules that they